My name is Stanislaw Luberda with AV Ultra, and this is lesson 9 of 10 in my Introduction to After Effects class. In this lesson, we're going to be talking all about the 3D camera tracker and some of the features and ways that you can use it in your compositions. So let's go ahead and get started here. I've got a piece of footage here that I shot at the Apostle Islands, and this is what I've got. And what I want to do is add some text here. Maybe I'm going to write the Apostle Islands in here. So how exactly can I use the 3D camera tracker? Well, if you remember my last lesson, we were able to track the motion of this particular piece of footage by tracking the motion here, or going into our window and opening up our tracker. Once we have our tracker open, we can track our camera. And this is going to work in the background. What After Effects is doing is very similar to what it was doing with the track motion, albeit a little bit more automatically. It is running through the scenes back and forth and trying to figure out where these pixels are in relation to each other. As an example, let's pretend we are on this pier and I had a little flag here, and I can place a flag right on this point right here. That flag would be there even though I was moving around. That's kind of what After Effects is trying to figure out. Depending on how long your clip is or the complexity of your clip, if there's a lot of motion and there's not a lot of contrast in your scene, it may take longer than others. In this example, this is a fairly high resolution footage, and you can see that it is working in the background, scanning through the frame. As a best practice, this particular scene isn't necessarily meant for long pieces of footage. I'm using a clip here that's about 20 seconds long, give or take, and I probably wouldn't use it for anything longer than that. So just be aware of that. You want to use this sparingly. If you're only going to use it for 5 seconds in a clip, you might want to split your clip and only apply it to that first 5 seconds of it. While this is tracking, I'm just going to let it do its thing, and we're going to come back after it's complete. Once this is done, you're going to have a solving camera pop up on your screen here. And what that means is it's trying to determine where I physically was when I was shooting this piece of footage. It's using the information in the scene here to try to determine what changes are happening in a virtual three-dimensional space. And so if I go ahead and I click on my 3D camera tracker, you'll notice that I've got all these different points. And as I hover over these points, you'll see this giant target appearing on the screen here. That's After Effects trying to determine which points to triangulate to create a plane. What I can do is I can actually select individual points by holding down Command here on my Mac, and I can specify individual points. In fact, if I play through the scene, you can see where After Effects is placing these track points. And so I'm just going to go ahead and select some of these here. And what I'm trying to do is just determine where exactly this ground plane is. Now this is a little large, so I'm going to take my target size and pull that down. And once I have that, I'm actually going to select a different area here, right about here, and you can see it's selecting these 3 points. So it's always trying to triangulate where I am here. And I'm going to right click and create something in a camera. I can either create text, solid, a null, or something called a shadow catcher on light. I can also go ahead and create 5 layers right away, and this is fairly new in the newer versions of After Effects. I use this more often than one of these, but for our purposes right now, we're just going to create a text and camera. And as soon as I do that, it creates a giant piece of text here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to scale that down. And I'm going to work with this and rotate this a little bit. So I'm going to pull up my rotation, and I'm going to make sure to stay on the individual planes. Now that's very important. You can see I'm just moving on the Z-axis. And if I'm going to change to my position tool, I'm only moving on this X-axis. And the same is true with this Y. I'm going to bring this a bit closer here and place that right about here. Now that I have this text, I can write welcome. And I'm just going to select that all and make that a bit smaller. Change that to white with a little bit of a black stroke. And if I play this backwards now, you can see that that's linked right to there. So what exactly is happening here? Well, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to just open up my tracker again and pick some points again, and we're going to make a solid. And I'm going to make this solid here. We're going to turn everything else off. I'm going to rotate this solid here, and we're going to go ahead and make this our pier. So I'm going to scale this down here a little bit, move this over right about there, and we're going to scale this way up. And you'll notice that it's matching pretty closely. That's pretty cool. And so I'm going to go ahead and zoom out, and we're going to change our view now to a three-dimensional view. So if I change this to here, there's that same solid. And what's really interesting here is I have this virtual camera. So this is what it created. So based on the information I gave After Effects, it is determined that I moved the camera as I walked down this pier. So let's go ahead and jump back into our active camera here. I'm going to turn off this solid for right now. We just have our welcome. And I've got my welcome there. I'm going to duplicate it and just move it down in the Y axis. We'll change this to, and it says, welcome to the Apostle Islands. We're just going to make that a little bit bigger. And I'm actually going to go ahead and scale this up. I'm actually going to drag this like that, because that's going to make it a little bit easier to read. Kind of give it the illusion that it's quite a bit bigger. So what's really cool about this is now I've got this text, and that's locked to that virtual 3D space. Now there's other things that we can do with this too. So now that we have this information, we can kind of work with this a little bit more. So I can actually go into my effects and presets, and maybe I want to animate some of this stuff in. And we're going to animate in our text. In fact, let's go with the 3D text. And we're going to flutter them in from the left. So now as this plays back, we actually have this building up onto our scene. Now, as this is right now, it's obviously not too believable that this is there. I'm going to undo those animations. So we can work with this a little bit more. Because our original footage is two-dimensional, but we've extrapolated fake 3D information from it, we can go into our camera layer, open it up, and actually put on a depth of field. So we can actually give this a little bit of depth. So typically I'd want to blur something like this out, but with a little bit of depth of field, it gives it a little bit more realism. Obviously, if I get too close to something, my focal length is off, it's going to go a little blurrier. So I can actually adjust my focus distance or my aperture to kind of mimic real life. As an example here, so if I have this welcome to the Apostle Islands, and we move this really far out, say something out over here, that's actually going to come more into focus as we get further down this pier. So that's one example. Let's go ahead and take a look at another example that I've got here. So I'm going to come back into my projects here. And in this other example here, I have a sign that we've replaced. So here's what I've replaced it with, and here is our original. Now, I could probably do this with another 4-point perspective. If you remember in our other lesson, I'd have to kind of cut this out here like that. But 4-point perspective can get a little tricky when our object either leaves the scene or comes onto the scene halfway through, or is an irregular shape. So if I wanted to make this match perfectly in here, I'd kind of have to work with it back and forth. And if I'm just doing a simple replacement, it might be easier just to plop that on there. So let's do this one here really quick. So I'm going to open up my camera tracker, and we're going to start fresh with this guy. So here's the original. Again, right click, track camera. It's going to analyze in the background. You'll notice that it says initializing, and the shot type. So we have a fixed angle of view or variable zoom. So if you have footage that is zooming in or out, it'll take that into account. Right now I'm not using any kind of zooms or anything like that, so we're using a fixed angle of view. When you run into different zooms and different angles, things can get really kind of funky because things won't be blurred out. You're going to have to account for that in your replacement composition. I'm going to let it do its thing, and we're going to come back once it's done. And now that that's complete, we can take a look at our footage and see what After Effects is tracked here. So we've got lots of different things that we have tracked here. Again, we have lots of variations in contrast and luminance that makes it pretty easy to track. Things like the background here is a little bit harder because there's not a lot of contrast up here, especially up in the sky. That gets a little bit trickier. What I want to do is maybe put some text that's going to be floating in the air right here, so I can actually pick right here, right click, and we're going to create a solid end camera, and we're going to go ahead and create a text. So now that I've got that text, looks like there are two different points just slightly, so I'm just going to line that up, and I'm going to scale that down a bit here. Okay. And we're going to go ahead and make this solid a little bit more transparent. And we're going to make a little warning here. Tension. Duplicate it. So that way it's in the same exact X and Y coordinates. Everyone knows bears are jerks. And now I can go ahead and play that through. So that's just a couple different ways that we can use the 3D tracker here. We could also add believable lights and shadows to this too. So if I come back into my footage here, I can choose the same area here and create something called a shadow catcher and light. And what a shadow catcher and light are, well, a light layer is just a plain light layer. And a shadow catcher is an invisible layer that only catches shadows. So you'll notice that in the background right here, it's actually catching a shadow from that light. And that's not necessarily what we want because it looks like a weird drop shadow in space. I want the attention, do not feed the bears, to actually have that shadow. So we'll do that. And it's also created a light layer, and I'm going to give the light layer the same position as my attention here, just so I can find it a little easier. Now you can see that it's actually catching a little bit of this shadow in here. So now that I have that, I can open this up and we can diffuse out that shadow a little bit, soften it. And let's work with this shadow catcher just a little bit too. There we go. So attention, do not feed the bears. They are jerks. So that is a quick introduction to the 3D camera tracker. By using nulls, we can also place things arbitrarily in space. So a lot of times I start with a null, and then from that point, I have my X and Y coordinates that I can easily place onto things. As one last example here, I just have a small composite that I put together here. And this composite has a couple pictures in it. I just put a couple pictures of some castles off in the background here, and even a landscape of Australia with the Great Barrier Reef. So you can see that that is actually plopped right in there, and I've just masked that out. So by putting it off in 3D space though, you can see that all these are 3D layers. They're locked pretty nicely to that background. So I could really put anything I want in that background and it would be locked to that same kind of plane. I find that it's a bit easier using the 3D camera tracker and creating a virtual 3D space to put together my composites, because that way I can work with my camera and create a little bit more believable depth of field and blurs in the background for my different objects. I just need to mask them out so that way they match a little bit better. So you can see there's my background and my castles. And then I use an adjustment layer just to tie all the colors together a little bit. This has been lesson 9 of 10 lessons in my Introduction to After Effects course. In the last lesson, we're going to be taking a look at exports and all the different ways that we can actually export our footage from Adobe After Effects. Again, my name is Stanislaw Luberda with AV Ultra, and hopefully you found this useful.